I watched my sister Celestia kneel before the high priestess, the golden light of the sacred ceremony bathing her smug face in divine radiance. Her hands trembled, not with humility, but with barely contained glee, as the crown of white lilies was placed upon her perfectly curled blonde hair. The crowd erupted in cheers. My mother sobbed tears of joy in the front row. My father beamed with pride. And I stood in the back, hidden among the common folk, my plain brown cloak pulled tight around my shoulders, watching the girl who had tormented me for 17 years receive the highest honor in our kingdom, the title of Saintess. The high priestess's voice rang out across the grand cathedral. Lady Celestia Hartwell, you have been chosen by the goddess herself. You are pure of heart, blessed in spirit, and destined to bring salvation to our people. Do you accept this sacred duty? I do, Celestia said, her voice dripping with false piety. I could see the triumph in her eyes even from here. She thought she'd won. She thought this was the ultimate victory over me, her forgettable younger sister who had always lived in her shadow. She had no idea she'd just signed her own death warrant. The ceremony continued with prayers and hymns, but I barely heard them. My mind was already 3 months in the future, to the day of Ascension, when the new Saintess would be taken to the sacred mountain to commune with the goddess. That's what they told everyone: communion, blessing, divine union. What they didn't tell anyone was that the first Saintess of each generation was always a sacrifice. The goddess demanded blood before she would grant her protection to the kingdom. The first Saintess would be ritually killed on the mountain, her life force used to renew the divine barrier that protected our lands from the monsters that lurked beyond our borders. I knew this because I had already lived through it once. In my first life, I had been the Saintess. I had worn that crown of lilies. I had walked up that mountain with hope in my heart, believing I was going to save everyone. And then the high priestess had driven the ceremonial dagger into my chest while the other priests held me down, and I had died screaming, betrayed, and alone at 17 years old. But something had gone wrong, or perhaps right. Instead of simply dying, I had been reborn, sent back to the beginning of my 17th year with all my memories intact. I woke up in my small, drafty bedroom in the Hartwell Manor, and the first thing I did was cry. Then I laughed. Then I started planning. Because I remembered everything. Every moment of abuse. Every casual cruelty. Every time Celestia had stolen my things, my achievements, my dignity. Every time my mother had looked at me with disappointment. Every time my father had forgotten my name. Every time I had been made to feel small and worthless and invisible. And now I remembered how it ended, with me dead on a mountain, sacrificed for a Bainlatabewaso, kingdom that had never loved me. Well, not this time. This time, Celestia could be the Saintess. This time, she could walk up that mountain. This time, she could be the sacrifice. I slipped out of the cathedral before the ceremony ended. No one noticed me leave. No one ever noticed me. That was about to change. My childhood was not filled with love. I should clarify, my sister's childhood was filled with love. Mine was filled with her leftovers. Celestia was born beautiful. Golden hair that caught the sunlight, blue eyes like sapphires, delicate features that made everyone who saw her gasp and coo. She looked like she'd stepped out of a fairy tale. People said she was blessed by the goddess herself. I was born 3 years later and I was ordinary. Brown hair, brown eyes, average features. Not ugly, but not remarkable. In any other family, I might have been considered pretty. But in the Hartwell family, standing next to Celestia, I was invisible. My mother, Lady Rosalind Hartwell, had been a renowned beauty in her youth. She had expected both her daughters to be equally lovely. When I emerged from the womb looking decidedly average, I think she never quite forgave me. She dressed me in Celestia's hand-me-downs, she forgot my birthdays, she introduced me to her friends as my other daughter, if she introduced me at all. My father, Lord Marcus Hartwell, was a man who valued appearances above all else. He was a minor noble who had married up, and he spent every waking moment trying to climb higher in society. Celestia was his prized jewel, his ticket to greater status. He paraded her at every social function, bragging about her beauty and charm and grace. He barely remembered I existed. Celestia, for her part, was a masterful actress. In public, she was sweet and loving to her dear little sister. She would hold my hand and smile prettily and say charming things about family bonds, but in private, behind closed doors, she was a monster. She stole my toys as a child and broke them, claiming I had been careless. She ripped my dresses before important events so I would look shabby. She spread rumors about me among the other noble children, painting me as jealous and bitter and pathetic. She forged notes in my handwriting, getting me in trouble with tutors and servants alike. And the worst part? Whenever I tried to defend myself, I was the one who got punished. Because perfect, beautiful, blessed Celestia would never do such things. It must be me. Ugly, jealous, worthless me trying to tear down my betters. By the time I was 10, I had learned to keep my head down and my mouth shut. I did my chores. I studied my lessons. I tried to be invisible. Because being invisible was safer than being noticed. But invisibility has its own kind of pain. I watched my parents beam with pride at Celestia's accomplishments I had often helped her achieve. I would help her with her homework, and she would present it as her own and receive praise while I received nothing. I would practice songs with her, and she would perform them at parties while I was left at home. I would design dresses that she would claim as her own ideas, basking in compliments while I stood in the corner in my shabby clothes. The servants pitied me, I think. Sometimes they would sneak me extra food or leave little gifts in my room. But they couldn't protect me. They had their own jobs to worry about, their own families to feed. And the Hartwells paid well, as long as you kept your mouth shut about how they treated their younger daughter. When I turned 16, something changed. The high priestess came to our manor to test both Celestia and me for divine potential. Every noble girl was tested at 16 to see if she had the blessing of the goddess, the rare gift that might mark her as a candidate for Saintess. They brought out the sacred crystal, a glowing orb that would shine brightly in the presence of divine favor. Celestia went first. She placed her hands on the crystal with a confident smile, already certain of her worthiness. The crystal glowed softly, a pleasant but unremarkable light, good enough to mark her as blessed but nothing extraordinary. Then it was my turn. I almost didn't want to touch it. I had learned to expect disappointment, but the high priestess gestured for me to approach, and I couldn't refuse. I placed my trembling hands on the crystal. It exploded with light. The entire room was bathed in brilliant white radiance. The high priestess gasped and fell to her knees. The crystal sang, a pure tone that made everyone in the room shiver. I stared at my hands in shock, watching divine power flow through my fingers like liquid starlight. I had been chosen, not Celestia, me. For the first time in my life, I was the special one. I should have known it wouldn't last. My parents' reaction was complicated. On one hand, having a daughter chosen as a Saintess candidate was an incredible honor. On the other hand, that daughter was me, and they had spent my entire life treating me as worthless. They couldn't quite reconcile these two facts. My mother suddenly became attentive, but in a calculating way. She wanted to make sure I looked presentable for when the church officials came to call. She couldn't have me embarrassing the family, could she? My father saw me as a potential asset now. He started introducing me to his friends, finally remembering my name, already planning how to leverage my new status. But Celestia. Oh, Celestia. She was furious. She hid it well in public, of course. She congratulated me with a smile that didn't reach her eyes. She told everyone how proud she was of her little sister, but in private, she was seething. The night after the testing, she came to my room. I was sitting at my small desk, still dazed by the day's events, when she burst through the door without knocking. "This should have been mine," she hissed, all pretense of sisterly love. Gone. "I'm the eldest, I'm the beautiful one, I'm the one everyone loves. How dare you steal this from me?" "I didn't steal anything," I said quietly. The goddess made a mistake," she shrieked. She grabbed the cup of tea from my desk and threw it against the wall, where it shattered. "You don't deserve this. You're nothing. You've always been nothing." I should have fought back. I should have stood up for myself. But 17 years of conditioning is hard to break. I just sat there and took it, tears running down my face while she raged at me. Eventually, she left. But that was just the beginning. Over the next several months, as I prepared for this Saintess selection ceremony, Celestia launched a campaign of sabotage. She poisoned my food to make me sick before important meetings with church officials. She destroyed my study materials so I would fail tests of religious knowledge. She spread rumors that I was secretly cruel and manipulative, that I had somehow cheated during the crystal testing. She was playing a dangerous game. If she had been caught, it would have meant severe punishment. But she was careful, and everyone loved her, and no one suspected beautiful, perfect Celestia of such crimes. I grew thin and exhausted. I was sick more often than I was healthy. My performance in my training suffered. The church officials looked at me with increasing doubt. Had they made a mistake? Was this pale, sickly girl really chosen by the goddess? But the high priestess had been there when the crystal sang. She knew what she had seen. She advocated for me, convinced that I was the true candidate despite my struggles. And so, in my first life, I became the Saintess. I was crowned at 17. I wore the white robes and the crown of lilies. I stood before thousands and accepted my sacred duty. My parents cried with joy, not for me, but for the honor I brought them. Celestia smiled and hugged me and whispered in my ear, "You stole my destiny. I hope you choke on it." 3 months later, they took me to the sacred mountain. I was excited, nervous, but excited. I thought I was going to commune with the goddess, to receive her blessing, to become something more than human. The high priestess and 5 other senior priests accompanied me. We climbed for hours up ancient stone steps carved into the mountainside until we reached the summit where the altar stood. The altar was stained dark with old blood. I should have recognized the warning sign, but I was 17 and stupid and desperate to believe that I mattered, that I was special, that I was finally worthy of love. They told me to lie down on the altar. They said it was part of the ritual. I obeyed. That's when they revealed the straps. I fought, but I was one girl against 6 adults, and they had done this before. They strapped me down efficiently, ignoring my screams, my pleas, my desperate questions. The high priestess stood over me with the ceremonial dagger, her face blank and cold. "The goddess requires sacrifice," she said. "The first saintess of each generation must give her life to renew the divine barrier. This has been the way for 1,000 years. Your death will save the kingdom." "But you chose me," I screamed. "You said I was blessed. You said I was special." "You are special," she replied. "Special enough to die for everyone else." The dagger came down. I died on that mountain, my blood soaking into the altar. My final thoughts a jumble of betrayal and rage and desperate, useless hope that someone would save me. But no one did. And then I woke up. I was back in my bed, in my small room in the Hartwell Manor. Sunlight streamed through the narrow window. I could hear servants moving around downstairs. For a moment, I thought the mountain had been a nightmare. Then I sat up and checked my chest. No wound, no scar, but I remembered the pain. I remembered everything. I was alive. I was 16 again. And I had been given an impossible gift, a second chance. The first thing I did was cry. The second thing I did was laugh hysterically. The third thing I did was start planning. The crystal testing was in 3 days. In 3 days, I would touch the crystal and it would sing for me, and I would be marked as the goddess's chosen, and my life would become a countdown to death, unless I changed things. But how? If I refused to touch the crystal, that would be seen as heresy. If I touched it and it didn't react, that would solve nothing. Celestia would be tested, and if her moderate blessing was the best available, she might be selected anyway, and she would survive the mountain. The ritual required someone with strong divine potential. They needed a powerful sacrifice. I spent those 3 days in a haze of memory and grief and growing anger. I relived every moment of abuse, every casual cruelty, every time I had been made to feel worthless. And I remembered dying for a kingdom that had never cared about me, dying so that people who had never loved me could live in safety. Why should I? Why should I sacrifice myself again for people who saw me as disposable? And then I had a terrible, beautiful idea. What if I didn't? What if I made sure Celestia became the Saintess instead? I could sabotage myself. I could make sure my display of divine power was less impressive than hers. The church wanted a strong Saintess, yes, but they also wanted someone beautiful and charming and perfect, someone who fit their image of what a holy maiden should be. Celestia was all of those things. If I made myself look weak or unworthy, and if I helped Celestia look stronger, they might choose her instead. It would take work. I would have to be subtle. But I had knowledge no one else possessed. I knew exactly what the church was looking for. I knew the tests. I knew the schedule. I knew everything. And more than that, I knew what Celestia wanted. She wanted to be the Saintess. She wanted the glory, the attention, the worship. She had always been jealous of my selection in my first life. Fine, this time she could have it. This time she could walk up that mountain. The rage that flooded through me at that thought was dark and terrible and absolutely intoxicating. For 17 years, for 2 lifetimes, I had been the victim. I had suffered and endured and tried to be good despite everything. I was done being good. Celestia wanted my destiny. She could have it, all of it, including the ending she had never known was coming. The day of the crystal testing arrived. I had spent the previous 3 days carefully setting my plan in motion. I had been eating herbs that would make me look slightly ill, pale and weak, not sick enough to postpone the testing, but enough to make me look less than ideal. I had also been speaking with the servants, carefully planting the idea that I was nervous about the testing, that I wasn't sure I was worthy, that I felt overshadowed by my beautiful sister. The servants gossiped, of course. That's what servants do. And gossip travels. By the time the high priestess arrived at the manor, the rumors had already spread. The younger Hartwell girl was fragile and uncertain. The older one, however, was confident and radiant and perfect. The testing took place in our drawing room. The high priestess set up the sacred crystal on a velvet cushion. My family assembled. Celestia practically vibrated with anticipation. "Lady Celestia," the high priestess said, "you are the eldest. You may go first." Celestia approached the crystal with her head held high, every inch the perfect, noble lady. She placed her hands on it, and it glowed. Softly at first, then brighter. I watched carefully. In my first life, it had been a moderate glow, unremarkable. This time, it seemed a bit stronger. Had my rebirth changed things, or had Celestia been preparing for this differently? Either way, her glow was impressive enough to make the high priestess nod with approval. "Well done, Lady Celestia. You clearly carry the goddess's blessing." Celestia preened. My mother looked ready to burst with pride. My father was already calculating social advantages. Then it was my turn. I approached the crystal slowly, making sure to look hesitant and nervous. That part wasn't hard. I was actually terrified that my plan wouldn't work, that the crystal would betray me by singing as loudly as it had before. I placed my hands on the crystal and immediately started doing something I had learned in my months of religious training in my first life. I suppressed my power. Divine energy can be controlled, shaped, hidden. It's one of the first things they teach Saintess candidates. I had never thought to use it during a testing, but now I pushed down hard on my own divine potential, forcing it to stay dormant, to stay quiet. The crystal glowed, but it was a soft, weak glow, dimmer than Celestia's. Unremarkable. I heard my mother's sharp intake of breath, my father's disappointed grunt, and I heard Celestia's barely suppressed laugh. The high priestess frowned. "Try again, child. Perhaps you were nervous and blocked the flow." I pretended to try harder. I even let a little more power through this time, enough to make it look like I was genuinely attempting to do my best. The glow brightened slightly, but still remained far less impressive than Celestia's display. The high priestess examined me carefully. I made sure to look embarrassed and ashamed. After a long moment, she said, "You do have divine potential, Lady Alara, but your sister's blessing appears to be stronger." Victory tasted like ash and honey in my mouth. Over the next several months, I continued my careful campaign of self-sabotage. When church officials came to interview us, I made sure to seem uncertain and awkward while Celestia shone. When we were tested on religious knowledge, I deliberately gave imperfect answers while helping Celestia memorize the correct ones. When we were evaluated on poise and grace, I tripped over my own feet while Celestia glided like a swan. It was harder than I expected. Part of me, the part that still remembered being chosen, being special, being more than invisible, wanted to excel, wanted to prove myself, but I crushed that part down ruthlessly. I had died once for glory. I wouldn't die again. Celestia, of course, assumed I was simply inferior. She treated me with even more contempt than before, if that was possible. She mocked me in private for my failures. She crowed about her own successes. She was certain she would be selected as Saintess, and her ego grew more monstrous by the day. My parents' treatment of me didn't improve, but it didn't worsen either. They had a new golden child to focus on, and I faded back into invisibility. That was fine. I preferred it. Invisibility gave me freedom to plan. Because I wasn't just sabotaging myself, I was also preparing for what came after. In my first life, I had died and the kingdom had continued. The divine barrier had been renewed. Monsters had been kept at bay. Everything had been fine for everyone except me. But I had also learned something during my training. The barrier ritual was more complex than the church admitted. The sacrifice was real, yes, but there were contingencies, backup plans, ways to modify the ritual if something went wrong. I began researching. The Hartwell Manor had a surprisingly extensive library. My father collected books as status symbols, though he rarely read them. Hidden among the leather-bound volumes of poetry and philosophy, I found older texts, religious histories, accounts of past saintesses, and buried in the dry academic language, I found references to the ritual, to alternative methods, to the true nature of divine power. The more I learned, the more my plan evolved. I wasn't just going to let Celestia die on that mountain. That would be too simple, too clean. She would become a martyr, a tragic saint, remembered and loved forever. My parents would mourn her. Songs would be written about her sacrifice. No, I wanted something else. I wanted her to survive long enough to understand what had been done to her, long enough to realize that I had known, long enough to feel the betrayal I had felt, and I wanted everyone to know what kind of person she really was. But I had to be patient. I had to let everything play out. I had to watch her be crowned Saintess while I stood in the shadows. I had to smile and congratulate her and pretend to be happy for my sister. And then I had to wait 3 months for the day of Ascension. It was the longest 3 months of my 2 lives. After Celestia's coronation, she became utterly insufferable. She had always been vain and cruel, but now she had an entire kingdom worshiping her. People lined up to catch a glimpse of the new Saintess. Children threw flowers at her feet. Artists painted her portrait. Poets composed odes to her beauty and grace. She moved into the church's sanctuary, as was traditional for the Saintess during her preparation period. She lived in luxury, attended by servants, visited by nobles and commoners alike who sought her blessing. My parents visited her daily, basking in her reflected glory. No one visited me. I had moved to a small apartment in the lower city, using the modest inheritance my grandmother had left me, an inheritance my parents had tried to keep from me in my first life, but which I had claimed immediately upon my rebirth. It wasn't much, but it was mine, a place where I could work undisturbed. I spent those 3 months preparing. I gathered evidence of Celestia's true nature. The servants I had quietly befriended over the years were willing to testify to her cruelty once I explained what I planned. I mapped out the route to the sacred mountain, identifying places where I could hide and watch. I studied the ritual texts I had stolen from the church library, understanding exactly how the sacrifice worked and how it might be subverted, and I practiced my own divine magic. Because here's the thing, they don't tell you about divine power. It's not actually from the goddess. Or rather, it is, but not in the way the church teaches. The goddess doesn't grant power, she is power. Divine energy exists in the world, and some people are born able to channel it. The church has spent centuries building mythology around this, claiming the goddess chooses specific people, but the truth is simpler and stranger. Anyone with the gift can use divine power. They don't need a goddess's permission. They just need knowledge and will. I had both. I had died and been reborn. I had touched the divine in the most intimate way possible, through death itself. And I had knowledge from my first life, training that Celestia would never receive because she would die before her training was complete. I could do things Celestia couldn't. I could do things the church had forgotten were possible. I could rewrite the rules. 2 weeks before the day of Ascension, I received an unexpected visitor. One of the younger priests from the church, a man named Brother Thomas, who had always been kind to me during my first life. He knocked on my door late at night, looking nervous. "Lady Alara," he said, may I speak with you?" I let him in, offering tea, wondering what he wanted. He sat uncomfortably on my modest furniture, clearly struggling with something. "I shouldn't tell you this," he finally said, "but I've always felt guilty about what happened to you. How you were passed over despite your obvious potential." I waited. The truth is, some of us in the church questioned the decision. You had the stronger blessing initially, but the high priestess said it didn't matter, that Lady Celestia was the better choice for other reasons. He paused. I think she meant political reasons. Your sister is more palatable, more what people expect a saintess to look like. I understand, I said quietly. There's more. He leaned forward. I've been having doubts about the church's teachings. I've been reading old texts, and I found references to Lady Alara. What do you know about the Day of Ascension? What really happens on that mountain? My heart beat faster. What do you mean? I found records, old records, hidden in the archives, records of previous saintesses. His voice dropped to a whisper. They don't come back. They never come back. The church says they ascend to become one with the goddess, but the records suggest something else. They suggest sacrifice. I looked at him for a long moment. Then I said, You're right. His face went pale. So it's true? They're going to kill Lady Celestia? Yes. But that's murder. We have to stop them. We have to tell someone. Who would believe you? I asked. The church has been doing this for 1,000 years. They have the kingdom's trust. If you speak out, you'll be branded a heretic and silenced, maybe killed. But we can't just let them. Let me ask you something, Brother Thomas. Do you know what kind of person my sister is? Do you know what she's done to me, to others? He looked confused by the change of subject. She's the saintess. She's supposed to be pure, and she's a monster. I stood and walked to my desk, pulling out a folder. I have testimonies from servants she's abused, records of her cruelties, evidence of crimes that would shock you. Celestia is not a saint. She's a spoiled, vicious girl who has hurt everyone around her because she can. I handed him the folder. He read through it, his expression growing more horrified with each page. I had no idea. No one does. She's very good at hiding it. But I know, I've lived with it my entire life. I took the folder back. So let me ask you again. Do you want to save her? He struggled with that. I could see the conflict on his face, his moral horror at the planned sacrifice warring with his disgust at Celestia's true nature. It's still murder, he finally said. Yes, I agreed. It is, but Brother Thomas, let me tell you what I'm going to do. I'm going to make sure that when my sister walks up that mountain, she knows exactly what's waiting for her. I'm going to make sure she understands that this is the destiny she stole from me. I'm going to make sure she feels every bit of fear and betrayal that I felt. I paused. And then I'm going to save her at the last possible moment, when she's at her most terrified, when she truly understands what it means to be sacrificed. He stared at me. You're going to save her. But how? I have divine power too. Stronger than hers, actually. I've been studying the ritual. I can interrupt it, redirect it. The barrier doesn't actually need a death. That's a lie the church has been telling to maintain control. The barrier needs divine power, and it can be powered by other means. This was partly true. The barrier did need power, and death was the easiest source of massive divine energy. But I had found other methods in my research, methods that would work if I was strong enough and clever enough. If you save her, he said slowly, the church will know someone interfered. They'll hunt for whoever did it. I know. You'll be in terrible danger. I know that too, I smiled. But I'll also have exposed the church's greatest secret. The entire kingdom will know that they've been murdering girls for 1,000 years. The church will be destroyed, or at least fundamentally changed, and Celestia will live with the knowledge that her dear little sister saved her life after she spent years trying to destroy mine. Brother Thomas looked at me with something like awe and horror. You've thought this through. I've had time. What do you need from me? Nothing. I just needed to know if anyone else in the church suspected the truth. You've answered that question. I walked him to the door, but Brother Thomas? When this is over, when the truth comes out, I'll need witnesses. People within the church who can confirm that the old records exist. People who can testify that this has been happening for centuries. Will you do that? He nodded slowly. Yes. If you can truly save Lady Celestia, if you can stop this, I'll testify to everything I know. Good. I opened the door, Barazon. Then I'll see you in 3 weeks. After the day of ascension. After everything changes. He left, and I closed the door behind him, leaning against it and breathing slowly. Part of my plan was falling into place. I had an ally in the church, someone who could corroborate my story when I exposed the truth. Now I just had to survive the next 3 weeks. The day of ascension arrived cold and clear. Celestia was dressed in elaborate white robes embroidered with gold thread. Her crown of lilies was fresh and perfect. She looked like a vision from a storybook, and the crowds that lined the streets wept at her beauty. I watched from the shadows as she processed through the city, heading toward the mountain path. The high priestess and 5 other senior priests accompanied her, just as they had accompanied me in my first life. Musicians played hymns, children sang. It was a beautiful ceremony. No one knew it was a funeral procession. I had already climbed the mountain the night before, taking a hidden path I had discovered during my research. I had supplies stashed at various points: food, water, materials I would need for my intervention. I had also set up observation posts where I could watch the ritual without being seen. Now I waited at one of those posts, high above the main path, watching through a gap in the rocks as Celestia and her escorts climbed slowly upward. It took them 4 hours to reach the summit. I had been waiting for 6, and my legs were cramped and my fingers were numb with cold, but I didn't move. I couldn't risk being discovered. Finally, they reached the altar. I had a clear view from my hiding spot. I could see everything: the blood-stained stone, the ceremonial implements, the sacred texts. And I could see Celestia's face as she looked around, taking in the scene. She was still smiling, still proud. She thought this was her moment of glory. The high priestess began the ritual chant. The other priests formed a circle around the altar. Celestia stood in the center, her hands clasped in prayer, her face serene. Then the high priestess said, "Lie down on the altar, child." Celestia's smile faltered. "Lie down? It is part of the ritual. You must lie down so that the goddess can embrace you." Something in the high priestess's tone must have warned her, some instinct for self-preservation that had kept her safe through years of manipulation and cruelty. Celestia took a step back. "I don't think." "Lie down," the high priestess repeated, and her voice was cold. The other priests moved forward. Celestia looked around wildly, finally understanding that something was wrong. She tried to run, but they caught her easily. She screamed, a high, terrified sound that echoed off the mountain walls. They dragged her to the altar and forced her down. She fought them, kicking and clawing, but they were strong and experienced. They had done this before. They strapped her down efficiently, her white robes tangling around her thrashing legs. "No," she shrieked. "No, what are you doing? I'm the Saintess. I'm chosen. You can't." "You are chosen," the high priestess said calmly, pulling out the ceremonial dagger. "Chosen to die for the kingdom. This is the highest honor." Celestia's eyes went wide with terror. "No, no, please, I don't want to die. I'm too young. I haven't—" "Neither did the others," the high priestess said. "Neither did any of the Saintesses who came before you. But they did their duty, and now you will do yours." Celestia thrashed against the straps, screaming for help that wouldn't come. She begged and pleaded and cried. She promised things: money, power, anything, if they would just let her go. She cursed them. She cursed the goddess. She cursed me. "This is Alara's fault," she shrieked. "She should be here. She was chosen first. She should be the one dying." The high priestess raised the dagger. "Perhaps, but she is not. You are." The dagger began to descend, and I stepped out of my hiding place. "Stop!" My voice rang out across the mountaintop, amplified by the divine power I pushed into it. Everyone froze. The high priestess stared at me in shock. The other priests spun around, trying to locate the source of the voice. I walked forward into the open, stepping out from behind the rocks, my hands glowing with white light. "Alara," the high priestess gasped, "what are you doing here?" "Stopping you," I said simply. This is heresy. You cannot interfere with the sacred ritual. There's nothing sacred about murder. I raised my hands, and the divine power flowing through me intensified until I was surrounded by a nimbus of brilliant light. I know what you're doing. I know what you've always done. You murder girls to power the barrier. You call it sacrifice, but it's just murder. The high priestess's face hardened. We do what we must to protect the kingdom. One life to save thousands. It has always been this way. It doesn't have to be. I began to channel power into a working I had been preparing for months. It was complex, delicate, dangerous. I had to draw divine energy from the mountain itself, from the ancient stones and the air and the earth, and funnel it into the barrier without a death to catalyze the process. It required perfect control and enormous strength. I had both. The air around me began to glow. Patterns of light formed in the sky, sacred geometries that most people had forgotten how to read. The barrier between our world and the void where monsters lurked began to resonate, responding to my power. The high priestess saw what I was doing and went pale. That's impossible. You can't. The barrier requires divine power, I said, my voice strained with effort. Not death. You've been killing girls because it's the easiest way to generate massive amounts of power quickly. But there are other ways, slower ways that require skill and knowledge and strength. I have all three. Sweat ran down my face. My hands shook. This was harder than I had anticipated. The working was trying to collapse, to dissipate, and I had to hold it together through sheer will. The barrier fought me, wanting the death it had been promised, the death it had been fed for 1,000 years. But I was stronger. I pushed harder, drawing on every scrap of power I possessed, every bit of training I had received in my first life, every advantage my rebirth had given me. The patterns in the sky blazed brighter, the mountain trembled, and slowly, achingly, the barrier accepted my power instead of Celestia's death. I felt it snap into place, felt the divine energy lock into the ancient patterns, felt the barrier strengthen and solidify. It would hold for another generation. The kingdom was safe, and Celestia was alive. I collapsed to my knees, gasping, completely drained. The light around me faded. The priests stared at me in shock. Celestia was sobbing on the altar, still strapped down, her perfect makeup running in streaks down her face. The high priestess found her voice. "What have you done?" "Saved her," I said, "and exposed you." I gestured weakly toward the path. Coming up the mountain, drawn by the massive display of divine power, was a group of people I had carefully arranged to be nearby. Brother Thomas, several nobles who had always been suspicious of the church's secrecy, and a contingent of the king's guard. I had sent them messages, anonymous messages, suggesting they might want to witness the Day of Ascension from a closer vantage point. I had given them directions to secret paths. I had made sure they would arrive just in time to see the end of the ritual, just in time to see the high priestess holding a dagger over a screaming girl strapped to an altar, just in time to see me save that girl with divine power they hadn't known was possible. The high priestess realized her mistake. She dropped the dagger and tried to compose herself, but it was too late. The witnesses had seen everything. They had heard Celestia's screams. They had seen the straps, the blood-stained altar, the attempted murder. "Seize them," one of the nobles commanded, and the guards moved forward to surround the priests. Brother Thomas rushed to me, helping me stand. "You did it," he whispered. "You actually did it." "Not quite," I said. "One more thing." I walked over to the altar where Celestia lay sobbing. I looked down at her, my sister, my tormentor, the girl who had made my life hell for 17 years. And I smiled. "Hello, Celestia," I said. She stared up at me with tear-stained eyes. You knew. You knew this would happen." "Yes. You let me become Saintess even though you knew they would kill me." "Yes." "Why?" she whispered. "Why save me now? Why not just let me die?" I leaned close. "Because death would have been too kind. You would have become a martyr. People would have mourned you. But this? Living with the knowledge that I saved you? living with the knowledge that everyone now knows what you really are? That's so much better. I straightened and addressed the witnesses. I should tell you all something about the Saintess, about my dear sister Celestia. I pulled out the folder of evidence I had collected. She's not what she seems. She's not kind or pure or holy. She's cruel and vicious, and she's hurt everyone who's ever been weaker than her. I handed the folder to the nearest noble. These are testimonies from servants, tutors, and others who have suffered at her hands. These are records of her crimes. Read them, share them. Let everyone know who they almost died for. Celestia screamed in rage and humiliation, but she was still strapped to the altar and couldn't do anything but curse me. The noble began reading through the folder, his expression growing more disgusted with each page. The high priestess tried to maintain order. This is not relevant to— It's completely relevant, I interrupted. You chose her instead of me because she was more beautiful, more charming, more perfect. You chose appearances over substance, and you were going to murder her without ever knowing what kind of person she really was. I looked at her coldly. How many other girls have you killed who didn't deserve it? How many innocents have you sacrificed because it was easier than learning to do things the right way? She had no answer. The guards moved to free Celestia from the straps. She stood on shaking legs, her beautiful robes stained with tears and dirt, her crown of lilies crushed. She looked at me with pure hatred. I'll destroy you for this, she hissed. No, I said, you won't. You'll spend the rest of your life watching me be everything you pretended to be. You'll watch me be honored while you're forgotten. You'll watch me rebuild what you tried to tear down. I stepped closer. And every time you look in the mirror, every time you close your eyes, you'll remember this day. You'll remember the altar and the dagger and how close you came to death. You'll remember that I saved you, and you'll hate me for it. She lunged at me, but the guards caught her. They held her back while she screamed and fought, her perfect composure completely shattered. I turned away from her and addressed the witnesses. The church has been lying to you for 1,000 years. They've been murdering girls to power the barrier, calling it holy sacrifice. But it doesn't have to be this way. I've just proven that the barrier can be maintained without death. With knowledge and power and will, it can be done. The nobles looked at each other uncertainly. One of them said, but surely the church had reasons. The church had control, I interrupted. They had power, they had secrets, and they used those to maintain their authority over everyone. But I'm done with secrets. I'm done with authority that comes from murder, and I'm done with being invisible. I raised my hands and the divine light flared around me again, weaker than before, but still impressive. I am Alara Hartwell, and I carry the goddess's blessing. I was chosen first, passed over for being too ordinary, too forgettable, too honest about what I was. But I'm not ordinary. I'm not forgettable. And I won't be silenced. The mountain trembled slightly in response to my power. Everyone stepped back nervously. I will work with anyone who wants to reform the church, who wants to end the practice of sacrifice, who wants to build a better system. But I will not submit to the old ways. I will not be controlled, and I will not let anyone else die for secrets and lies. Brother Thomas stepped forward. I'll testify to everything I know. I'll help expose the truth. One by one, other voices joined his. Nobles who had always been suspicious, younger priests who had questioned the teachings, even some of the guards. They all pledged to support reform, to demand answers, to seek justice. The high priestess stood alone, her authority crumbling, her secrets exposed. She looked at me with something like respect and something like fear. You've destroyed everything, she said. Good, I replied. It deserved to be destroyed. The aftermath was chaos, of course. The king launched an investigation into the church. Records were unsealed. Testimonies were taken. The truth about the sacrifices was revealed to everyone, and the kingdom reeled from the revelation. There were riots. There were protests. There were calls for the high priestess and the other senior priests to be executed for murder. I argued against execution. Not out of mercy, I had none for them, but because I knew that martyrs were dangerous. Instead, I advocated for trial and imprisonment. Let them live with their crimes. Let them be forgotten in dark cells, their power gone, their secrets exposed. The king agreed. The church was restructured. New leadership was installed. Younger priests like Brother Thomas, people who wanted to do things differently. I was offered a position of authority, a new title, Divine Protector. My role was to maintain the barrier using the methods I had pioneered, teaching others how to do it, making sure the old ways of sacrifice were never used again. I accepted. My family's reaction to all of this was complicated. My father tried to reconcile with me, seeing opportunities for advancement through my new position. I refused to see him. I had no interest in his politics or his schemes. My mother sent letters, trying to explain that she had always loved me, that she had just been overwhelmed by Celestia's needs, that she regretted her actions. I burned the letters unread. Her regret came too late and meant too little. As for Celestia, she was stripped of her title as Saintess. The evidence I had presented was thoroughly investigated, and more victims came forward once they felt safe to speak. My sister was prosecuted for multiple counts of abuse and cruelty. She was found guilty. She was not imprisoned. Her crimes, while terrible, weren't quite bad enough for that, and her family connections protected her from the harshest punishments. But she was fined heavily, required to pay compensation to her victims, and sentenced to 5 years of public service in the poorest districts of the city. Celestia, who had always been served, would now serve others. Celestia, who had always been beautiful and pristine, would work in dirty streets, helping people she had always looked down on. Celestia, who had always been worshipped, would be scorned. The first time I saw her in her work clothes, scrubbing floors in a charity hospital, she looked up at me with such hatred that I thought she might attack me right there. But she didn't. She just returned to scrubbing, her once perfect hands red and raw. I didn't gloat. I didn't need to. Her punishment spoke for itself. I focused on my work instead. Maintaining the barrier was harder than I had expected, requiring regular rituals and constant vigilance. But I wasn't alone. Other people with divine potential came forward once they learned that there were options beyond death or obscurity. I trained them. I built a new order of divine practitioners, one based on cooperation and knowledge rather than sacrifice and secrets. It was hard work, exhausting work, but it was mine. I also reconnected with the servants who had been kind to me during my childhood. I hired many of them to work for me in my new capacity, paying them well and treating them with respect. They became my friends, my confidants, my chosen family. One of them, an older woman named Martha, who had always snuck me extra food, told me she was proud of me. I cried when she said it. It was the first time anyone had ever said those words to me and meant them. I was 20 years old, technically only 19 if you didn't count my first life, when the king personally thanked me for my service to the kingdom. He offered me land, titles, wealth. I accepted the wealth because I needed resources for my work, but I declined the titles. I didn't need them. I knew who I was. I knew what I was worth. And I didn't need anyone's permission or recognition to validate that. 5 years after the day of ascension, I stood on the sacred mountain again. This time, I climbed it voluntarily, and I climbed it alone. I wanted to see the altar where I had died, where Celestia had almost died, where everything had changed. The altar was still there, but it had been cleaned. The bloodstains were gone, scrubbed away by priests who were trying to atone for the crimes of their predecessors. Someone had placed flowers around it, fresh, beautiful flowers that turned the place of sacrifice into a place of remembrance. I stood before it and thought about my first life. That scared girl who had died screaming, that invisible daughter who had believed right up until the end that someone would save her. No one had saved her, but she had saved herself in a way. Her death had led to rebirth, and her rebirth had led to revolution. I heard footsteps behind me and turned. Brother Thomas, now High Priest Thomas, climbed the last few steps to join me at the summit. "I thought I might find you here," he said. "Nostalgia," I replied with a slight smile. "Hardly." He looked at the altar. "This place doesn't hold good memories for either of us." "No, but it holds important ones." We stood in silence for a while, looking out over the kingdom spread below us. From here, you could see everything: the city, the forest, the farmlands, the distant mountains. It was beautiful. "The new candidates are progressing well," Thomas said. "We'll have 3 new protectors certified by year's end." "Good. We need more." We need you to stop working so hard, he said. You're going to burn yourself out. I'm fine. Ilara. He turned to face me. You saved the kingdom. You exposed corruption. You revolutionized divine practice. You've done enough. You're allowed to rest. I shook my head. Not yet. There's still too much to do. There will always be too much to do. But you can't do everything. You're not responsible for the entire world. I know. I smiled at him. But I'm responsible for the parts I can change. He sighed but smiled back. Fair enough, but at least take a vacation. Go somewhere beautiful, do something frivolous. Be young for once. I considered it. When had I last done something just for myself? In either life, I had always been surviving, planning, fighting. Maybe Thomas was right. Maybe I had earned the right to simply exist without a purpose for a while. I'll think about it, I said. We descended the mountain together, talking about administrative matters and reform proposals and the 1,000 small details of running a new religious order. It was mundane work, but it was satisfying. Every small improvement made the kingdom a little better, a little safer, a little more just. At the base of the mountain, Thomas went back to the city while I turned toward my home, a small house on the outskirts, modest but comfortable. Martha had dinner waiting for me, and several of my students were coming over to discuss their progress. As I walked, I passed through the charity district where Celestia was still serving out her sentence. I didn't go looking for her, but I saw her anyway. She was distributing food to the poor, her face blank and tired. She looked older than her years. Broken, she saw me too. For a moment, our eyes met. I saw hatred there, yes, but also something else. Something like understanding. She knew what I had done and why. She knew that she had earned every bit of her punishment. I nodded to her, not in greeting, not in friendship, but in acknowledgement, and continued walking. Some wounds never fully heal. Some families can never be repaired. But justice can be served. That night, I sat with Martha and my students and ate dinner and laughed at stupid jokes and felt, for the first time in 2 lifetimes, genuinely content. I had a home. I had a purpose. I had people who valued me for who I was, not what I looked like or who my family was. I had survived. I had won. Before bed, I stood at my window and looked up at the stars. I thought about the goddess, the divine force that had killed me and then brought me back, that had given me power and purpose and a second chance. Thank you, I whispered. The night offered no response, but I didn't need one. I knew the truth. The goddess hadn't saved me. I had saved myself. The divine power, the rebirth, the knowledge, those were just tools. I was the one who had wielded them. I was the one who had chosen to fight back instead of accepting victimhood. I was the one who had turned tragedy into triumph. I was Ilara Hartwell, and I was no one's sacrifice. Years later, when I was older and my work had spread across multiple kingdoms, when the practice of sacrifice had been abolished everywhere and divine power was understood as a science rather than a mystery, people asked me if I regretted anything, if I would change anything about what had happened. I told them the truth. I regretted my first death. I regretted the years of abuse. I regretted that it took dying to learn to fight back, but I didn't regret letting Celestia walk up that mountain. I didn't regret making her face the death she had tried to force on me. I didn't regret exposing the church's crimes or destroying their authority. Because sometimes the only way to change a broken system is to break it completely. Sometimes the only way to save yourself is to let your enemies think they've won, right up until the moment you prove them wrong. And sometimes the greatest revenge isn't death or suffering, it's living well, living freely, living loudly enough that everyone knows you can't be silenced. I lived. Celestia lived too, but diminished, humiliated, forced to confront the person she had been. My parents lived with the knowledge that they had thrown away their better daughter for a golden facade. The church lived, reformed and rebuilt by people who valued truth over tradition. Everyone lived, but only I truly thrived. That's the ending I chose. That's the ending I earned, and it was infinitely better than dying on a mountain, sacrificed and forgotten, mourned by people who had never loved me. I wrote my own story this time, and I made sure it had the ending I deserved. Not tragic, not noble, not sacrificial, but triumphant.